With the coming of daylight on the fourth day at Tarawa, the Marines were able to see in all too graphic terms how fierce the Banzai attack had been. Only then could the terrible action be assessed. There was no question that the night had been a brutal one. The gruesome vista belied description. One man was reminded of those strange screwball pictures you see of a desert with a lot of wrecked watches and melted telephones, and nothing but just utterly weird ruins. It was something on that order, only much stranger. When Captain Lyle Specht surveyed the carnage, he was shocked. In some spots, he said, dead bodies, Marines and Japanese alike, were stacked 4 and 5 deep. In fact, as the Marine units reformed their lines, it was found that Company B had been greatly reduced. Only 45 men remained capable of continuing the fight effectively out of the 85 or so who had dug in the evening before. These survivors were merged with Company A, which also had suffered heavy losses. Company B, in effect, ceased to exist. Perhaps 800 men were left in the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, which had taken the full force of the Japanese counterattack. It had gone into action the previous morning reinforced to 1,100 men. In the night fighting, it had lost 45 men killed and 128 wounded and missing. The battalion was pulled out of action and moved back to the beaches at dawn. The destroyers Sigsbee and Schroeder, which had supported the Marine defence with naval gunfire, had fired their coffers dry. The 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, had shot off 1,500 rounds of 75mm ammunition, hundreds of which had been hand-carried directly from the Burns-Philp pier even as the guns were firing. A total of 325 Japanese lay dead inside and beyond the American lines. The remainder of the enemy still on the island, perhaps 500, many wounded, most without weapons or ammunition, had withdrawn into the heavy fortifications on the Bird's Tail. Here they waited listlessly for the Marines to come at them again. When Lieutenant Norman Thomas reported to the battalion command post in the morning to check on his wounded, a Marine combat correspondent approached him and asked about the night of horrors. "The boys stood up to it, slugging it out with the Japanese," he said weakly, leaning against a coconut tree and staring at the torn bodies that lay around him, unburied in the hot sand. "They stood up to it by sheer guts alone." Thomas said that it had been touch and go, from the beginning of the first attack to the last. All that time, he said, his company had been in grave danger of being overwhelmed. Of his men, he concluded, every damn one of them is a champion. He then closed his eyes and fell asleep, his back resting against a splintered palm tree. The battle also was nearly over for the Marines of the units still in the front lines. Even as the Japanese had been counterattacking during the night, behind the American lines the embattled island of Betio was being transformed. Working all through the previous day and night, several hundred Seabees had been toiling on the airfield, filling in shell holes, smoothing the main runway. Bulldozers buried the island in crushed coral, then packed it down, spread it out, and graded it. The beaches, too, were soon unrecognizable. Trucks and jeeps appeared, towing electrical generators, water and fuel caissons, and AA guns. Before the battle was finished, then, Tarawa was already becoming what the Marines had been told it would be, an advanced toehold in the Central Pacific far more powerful offensively than the Japanese had ever dreamed of making it defensively. At 0800, the fresh 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, under Lieutenant Column Kenneth F. MacLeod, having replaced its bloodied sister battalion in the line, jumped off in what quickly had all the earmarks of a rout. By this time, Rear Admiral Shibasaki had been killed, and the Japanese who remained were severely demoralized. They were now pressed into a few hundred square yards of heavily cratered ground, from the east end of the airfield to the tail end of the island. Deep trenches ran diagonally through the area from coast to coast, interspersed with thick but lightly manned fortifications. The most formidable of these, a concentration of bomb-proofs and trenches, became the locus of the final Japanese resistance. Here the last stand would be made. MacLeod's company. I moved up the centre against light opposition for a distance of 350 yards until it was blocked by the enemy stronghold. There it was ordered to stop and deal with the resistance. The defenders were holed up in 3 enormous bomb-proof shelters, each mutually supporting with lateral trenches and wide fields of fire overlaying the system. 1 or 2 sprouted machine guns and all were manned by riflemen. The Marines here were aided by the presence of Colorado, the seemingly indestructible Sherman tank commanded by its equally intrepid crew chief, Lieutenant Louis Largy. Colorado was the last fully operational Sherman on the island. China Gal, commanded by Lieutenant Edward Bale, had lost its main gun in the D-Day fighting and had only its machine guns still working. It was now being used as an armoured supply carrier. 2 of the enemy strong points and all their covering positions were reduced to rubble by flamethrowers and demolitions trained down their air shafts. The third, however, proved more difficult to subdue. As flamethrower teams closed in on it and began unleashing their jets of fire, the massive steel doors burst open and the Japanese charged out. Largy had just manoeuvred Colorado into position to cover the attack when the defenders surged forward. He cut loose with an HE round at point-blank range, and 50 Japanese were eviscerated instantly. The dazed survivors were shot to death as they wandered about in the open. Meanwhile, the bulk of the rest of the battalion fought up the southern coast and around the right. They made astounding gains all morning, forcing the fight with naval gunfire, tanks, flamethrowers, and demolitions. The toll on the listless defenders was terrible. By 10:30, one of the 2 advancing assault companies was pinched out of the shrinking front, now only 200 yards wide, and fell back in a supporting role. Japanese resistance from here on was so feeble that this reserve company hardly fought again. The Navy fighters and bombers had flown their last missions. The 2nd Division Artillery, which now had 75mm and 105mm howitzer battalions emplaced on Bairiki as well as Betio, was not used at all, much to the disappointment of the gun crews. The opposing forces were simply too close for such devastating support, and there were more Marines on the tail of the island than Japanese. Now that the lines had straightened out, anything that moved ahead of the Marines was fair game and was fired at. Though some pockets of resistance were encountered, in most places the enemy was wiped out with quick and ruthless dispatch. Gunnery Sergeant L.L. Lucas and the men under his command watched several Japanese stumble from a shell hole, trying to reach a pillbox farther back. They threw grenades, and 1 or 2 of the enemy went down. Lucas and his men ran up the beach and discovered the Japanese huddled in their hole, unarmed, convulsive and obviously nearly out of their minds. The Marines tossed in grenades, and arms and legs just flew out the entrance. 1 Japanese somehow survived the blast, but he was swiftly bayoneted to death. By now we had quit even trying to take prisoners, recalled Lucas. In their drive to the tail end of the island, the Marines had found evidence that wounded Americans had been captured and killed during the battle. By 13:10, enemy resistance to the front of the Marines was down to 20 square yards at the tip of the island. A band of Marines from Company K and Company L swept over the last position in a mere 15 minutes. The battle for Betio was nearly finished. In the sweep to the tail end of the island, 475 Japanese were killed, and 14 prisoners, all but 1 were Korean labourers, were captured. 9 Marines had been killed or were missing, and 25 were wounded. All that remained was to finish off the Japanese still holding on grimly in the pocket. This stubborn complex of pillboxes and bunkers at the junction of Red 1 and Red 2, which had defied the 2nd Division since D-Day and had inflicted the heaviest casualties on the Marines, would be the last enemy bastion to fall on Betio. At the same time, the battle for Makin, the operation that Major General Holland Smith 4 days earlier had hoped would end quickly, also proceeded inexorably toward its elusive end. In Lieutenant Column Joe Hart's front lines, the soldiers had repelled one fierce attack after another during the night, while fending off drunken enemy troops in numbers that had long been written off. Gone was the fear of the night before, that the battle would never be finished. The Japanese, their remaining strength expended during the night, were now reeling and in complete collapse. The American soldiers, who were bolstered by more than 20 tanks to spearhead their final attack, sensed this. At precisely 07:15 they jumped off smartly. For 5 miles, all the way to the end of Butaritari, as many soldiers as possible hung to the sides of the tanks as they roared eastward down the single-lane road. By 10:30, advanced elements of this armoured fist had reached the tip of the island, and all organised resistance at Makin was declared to be over. Only a handful of Japanese had been encountered along the way, and these were silenced swiftly. An hour later, Major General Ralph Smith radioed to Rear Admiral Turner, "Makin taken." Except for minor mopping-up action, the battle for Makin was history. So ended the last day of combat for the first American soldiers to fight in the Central Pacific in World War II. In a sense, the victory was a Pyrrhic one. In some ways, it was a bitter disappointment. For the officers of the 27th Division, whose untried troops had marched forward through unimaginable heat and dust and had been held up for days by an infinitely inferior enemy force, and even more for the weary troops themselves. These soldiers, who knew little of the kind of fighting necessary on small islands, and who were poorly trained and led by their officers from start to finish, still felt proud of their showing in their first action against a formidable enemy. The battle for Makin, before the last Japanese and Koreans were killed or captured, had lasted 4 days. It had engaged a reinforced regimental combat team, about 6,500 soldiers backed by enormously strong naval and air forces, cost a total of 245 casualties, and held up the departure of the most vulnerable elements of the Fifth Fleet, as it would turn out, at least 1 day too long. They had been opposed by only about 280 Japanese combat troops, who were in action at different times and places over the period of 4 days on an island 11 miles long and no more than a few hundred yards wide. Casualties among enemy combat and support troops during those 4 days, including Korean labourers, amounted to 550 killed, or nearly the entire garrison. 104 prisoners were taken, all but one of whom were Korean labourers. But the full price for the capture of Makin was yet to be paid. At Tarawa, the Marines had surrounded the last bastion of Japanese resistance on Betio, the notorious redoubt they had dubbed the Pocket. The seemingly indestructible Japanese had suffered heavy losses and were beginning to lose ground. By mid-morning, at a conference at Major General Julian Smith's command post, the idea was voiced that it was time to mount an all-out attack led by the remnants of the 2nd Marines. Colonels Edson and Shoup pointed out that the Japanese tactics had been successful up to now, in that the Marines were continuing to suffer terribly in their piecemeal efforts. In their view, a massive knockout blow could not possibly prove more costly. Such an undertaking was bound to succeed given the numerical and material superiority of the Marines. Surrounded, though they were, with no hope of ultimate survival, the Japanese would not surrender. The Marines had to take this complex of fortifications, the strongest on the island, before Betio could be declared secured. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines and 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines moved against it from all sides, including a hastily organised frontal amphibious assault from the lagoon. Supported by tanks, flamethrowers, LVTs, demolitions and half-tracks mounting 75mm howitzers, they swarmed into and over individual pillboxes and bunkers. With grenades and angry determination to finish the job, they succeeded in gradually winnowing down the area held by the enemy. The furious action, in which 24 Marines were killed or wounded, was completed in the afternoon. No Japanese offered themselves as prisoners, and none were taken. Finally, at 13:30, Smith notified Rear Admiral Hill, "Betio has fallen." At the end of the day, after 4 full days of practically non-stop combat, the cost to the Marines and attached naval and Coast Guard personnel was an astonishing total of 3,000 casualties. For this, the 2nd Division had bought only the most important of all the incredibly small islands that make up Tarawa Atoll. The 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, was even now still working its way up the rest of the tiny chain in pursuit of a fleeing enemy force that numbered close to 200 in size. The battle for Tarawa would not be entirely over until this group of Japanese was eliminated. As dawn came up at Abemama on November 23rd, a native slipped across the channel dividing the V Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company and the small Japanese garrison. He was immediately taken to the command post for questioning, and surprised the company commander, Captain James Jones, with his information. "The saps," he told his interrogators with excitement. To the great amusement of the Americans, the Gilbertese alphabet did not include the letter J, "are all dead." It was welcome news to Jones, who had been contemplating how to rush the bothersome enemy stronghold after sunrise. Up to now he had not been certain how to do it. Now it seemed he would not have to try after all, though he had prepared diligently for the event. 2 days earlier, on the afternoon of November 21st, after 2 Marines had been wounded trying to eliminate the enemy strongpoint, Jones had radioed the submarine Nautilus. "Our weapons are too light to knock out the Japanese guns," he told Navy Lieutenant Commander Bill Irvin. "I'll surface at daybreak and we'll shell the hell out of them," said Irvin. The Marine explained that the strength of the entrenchments was such that the angle of the submarine's 3-inch deck gun would have to be flat. He doubted that the shells would have any effect. He was also worried about the natives. They had proved exceedingly friendly. Many were on the island where the Japanese had dug themselves in, and there was no way to alert them to find shelter. One stray shot into the midst of the helpless natives could prove seriously damaging to their future cooperation with the American garrison forces, due to arrive at Abemama within days. Then there was the question of the Marines themselves, who were dug in very close to the Japanese positions. Irvin was not deterred. "You just bring me a chart of the Japanese position." Jones personally paddled out to the submarine that night with a chart that pinpointed the Japanese position. He brought with him Private First Class, Harold Marrick, who had been badly wounded on the first day, and another less seriously injured Marine. Jones transferred these men to Nautilus. To some of the crew, it was a grimly familiar affair. Nautilus had taken on dozens of Marine casualties off Makin in 1942 during the famous action by Carlson's raiders. Jones and Irvin worked out the parameters of the bombardment so that the Marines and natives would be at minimum risk. Jones would display a large white banner, as it turned out, a mattress cover hastily hung from a coconut tree, to mark the northern limit of the Marine positions. The next day, Nautilus surfaced, and at daybreak commenced a furious shelling of the Japanese position. For the better part of the morning, Irvin directed the firing of 75 rounds of 3-inch ammunition. Meanwhile, after learning that the reconnaissance scouts had encountered opposition, Rear Admiral Hill had dispatched a destroyer to the scene. It had arrived in the afternoon of November 22nd, and also briefly lent its guns to the bombardment. "And that was all it took," explained the native now standing before Jones. As his interrogators pressed him to be explicit, the native went on. "When the Japanese learned that the Americans had landed, the enemy troops had taken as much food and supplies from the natives as they could carry back to their entrenchments, apparently preparing for a siege. Their commander told Father Mail that it was his intention to fight it out and then kill his men before the Americans overwhelmed them. But 4 Japanese were killed by the shelling of the submarine, and when the destroyer arrived, the rest lost all hope. They believed that an all-out assault was imminent, and they had no chance of withstanding such overwhelming firepower. However, the lieutenant commanding the garrison objected strongly to the demoralization around him. While exhorting his troops to new heights of resolve, brandishing a sword in one hand and defiantly waving his pistol with the other, he accidentally shot himself in the head and died. Without hope, the rest of the now leaderless garrison calmly dug their own graves, laid down in them, and committed suicide with their rifles. Shortly thereafter, Jones and the Marine scouts pushed across the fordable channel against no opposition and found the strange story to be true. Thus, all 3 of the primary objectives of Galvanic, Tarawa, Makin, and Abemama, fell on November 23rd, the 4th day of action. While Jones was investigating the ritual suicides on Abemama, aboard Nautilus, a different kind of ceremony was completed. The submarine surfaced at dawn, and its crew buried Private First Class Marrick at sea. He had died of his wounds during the night. Although a Marine battalion was on a forced march up the rest of Tarawa Atoll, the principal island of Betio was firmly in American hands. The first plane, a Navy Hellcat fighter with ensign, William W. Kelly of Castlewood, Pennsylvania, behind the stick, landed on the airfield before the battle was officially finished, and before the Seabees had completed smoothing the runways. Flying in, he had seen dozens of bodies floating at sea as far as 10 miles from Tarawa. Naively, he thought they were Japanese. In fact, they were Marines who had been killed on D-Day and the day after, whose bodies had been carried out to sea by the tides and currents. Climbing down from the cockpit, Kelly asked sheepishly, "Is it over?" The mob of cheering Marines who surged around him was answer enough. At Makin, the 27th Division had begun loading out. In the morning, the 2nd Battalion boarded a transport from Red 2 on the Hammerhead end of the island. Throughout the rest of the day, other battalions boarded ships at different points around the lagoon. The soldiers released their LVTs to the island garrison, and the convoy sailed for Hawaii at 1400. An infantry battalion and most of the heavy equipment also were left behind to defend the island. The escort carriers and some of the larger warships stayed behind in order to cover the build-up. The fighter squadron from the carrier Lexington intercepted a flight of Japanese Zeros headed for the Gilberts this same day, shooting down 17 of 21 bandits without the loss of a man. In the afternoon, army detachments were sent to scout Little Makin and other islands in the atoll. Few Japanese were encountered on the outlying islands, and resistance amounted only to small groups of stragglers who were easily killed or captured. 5 enemies seeking to cross the reef from Butaritari to Kuma were killed over the next few days. Much later, on December 13th, another 9 would be killed on the eastern end of Butaritari in a fierce firefight with 13 soldiers. Among these last enemy dead was the Japanese executive officer of Makin. At Tarawa, a port director was put in charge of the anchorage, which quickly began to fill with transports and cargo ships. Destroyers on active ASW patrol covered the naval movement into the lagoon. The 1st Navy and Marine combat elements went aboard transports the afternoon of November 23rd. For 3 days thereafter, the Burns Philp Pier and the beaches of Betio would be jammed with the process of loading and unloading. Rear Admiral Hill and his entourage came ashore to inspect the island that had been so difficult to seize. Japanese snipers were still much in evidence, and the Marines dug in for the night. During the hours of darkness, 3 men were killed and a half-dozen wounded in brief skirmishes, as Japanese survivors came out of their holes looking for food and water. The next day, November 24th, the Corps commander, Major General Holland Smith, arrived by plane to make his own tour. When he was informed that casualties, after an estimate was hastily calculated, would likely exceed 3,000, howlin' mad Smith was shaken deeply. The official victory ceremony took place precisely at noon on the 5th day, November 24th. The sun on Betio was hotter than it had been on any previous day of the battle, and the stench of 6,000 Japanese and American unburied dead was overpowering. Men often stopped what they were doing and dropped to their knees, retching. The explosions of demolitions work continued, and occasional firing still occurred as Marines and Seabees found the hiding places of persistent snipers. The noise sometimes interrupted the solemn service. The splintered trunks of 2 palm trees served as poles for the flag-raising ceremony. Private First Class James L. Williams of Birmingham, Alabama, a member of a tank crew, stepped forward and prepared to sound colours for the first time at Tarawa. Julian Smith stopped him when he saw that the Marine was wearing the clean white uniform of a Japanese sailor. Numerous Marines had discarded their own filth-encrusted uniforms for whatever Japanese clothing they could scrounge. At least one was seen working on the beach in nothing but a kimono. For this event, however, the general was adamant that the uniform of the day, certainly for the colour-bearer and honour guard, would comprise the dungarees, helmets and arms they had fought with. "Get those damn things off and keep them off," Julian Smith demanded of Private Williams. The man traded his outerwear with a nearby Marine, and the ritual proceeded. Technical Sergeant Vito Milione of Philadelphia walked to one of the poles. With him went Corporal Mickey M. Frankenstein of Los Angeles, one of the walking wounded among the Marine ranks. Williams raised the bugle to his parched lips, and colours was heard all across the island. Milione held the flag while Frankenstein attached it to the shrouds and raised the stars and stripes to the top of the blasted trunk. The area around the headquarters fell silent. A combat correspondent watched. Men turned from digging foxholes, from unloading boats, from burying the dead. They stood at attention, with their dirty, tired young hands held at salute. Some of the wounded managed to stand up too, while the more seriously hurt could only turn their heads as they lay on their litters. The assault troops paused in their shuffling toward the end of the pier. As the flag unfurled and snapped to the top, the Marines lost a little of their weariness and a little of their sorrow. A diminutive Union Jack was raised a few moments later on the other trunk. Major Frank Holland, the former Director of Education in the Gilberts, had produced the British flag from his pack. He had brought it from New Zealand. When the ceremony was over, the men got on with the work of disembarkation. Also, on the afternoon of November 24th, Captain William W. Lumpkin of Charleston, South Carolina, the division chaplain, dedicated the 2nd Marine Division Cemetery in a cleared area behind Red 2. Small burial grounds had appeared all over the island where men had buried their buddies in groups. Such areas were marked by simple crosses made from wooden slats torn from packing crates. One Methodist chaplain, Lieutenant Norman Darling of Jacksonville, New York, held more than 200 burial services in 1 hour. An 8th Marines chaplain, Wyeth W. Willard of Scituate, Massachusetts, by chance found the body of the man who formerly had been his clerical assistant on Guadalcanal, and whom he had recommended for combat duty as a platoon leader. Fewer and fewer Japanese were being captured or killed. Chief Petty Officer Tadeo Unuki and the 4 civilian construction workers with him had watched the fireworks of the ill-fated Banzai attack on the 3rd night from their vantage point on the reef. They had not been sure of the results until the next morning, when they saw the American fighter plane piloted by Ensign Kelly land. That night, the forlorn group waded across the reef to Betio in order to steal a boat and escape. Unuki was delirious with hunger and thirst, and along the way he became separated from the group when he stopped to claw some shellfish off the reef. He ate them voraciously. They made him violently ill, and upon reaching Betio he collapsed by the nearest bunker and fell asleep. It was here that he was found the next day and taken prisoner. Up the island chain, the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, continued their forced march until they cornered the elusive Japanese force on Bwariki on November 26th. That night and into the next morning, a fierce battle was fought in which 156 heavily entrenched Japanese, supported by 2 mortars and 10 machine guns, were killed at a cost of 32 American dead and 59 wounded. On November 29th, Abayang, Mayana and Maracay atolls, lying north, south and northeast respectively of Tarawa, were scouted. There were no Japanese on the latter 2, but on Abayang 5 of the enemy escaped the Marines by fleeing in a motor launch, presumably for the Marshalls. Abemama was occupied in force on November 25th, and Seabees quickly went about clearing an area for an airfield. Rear Admiral Spruance came ashore at Tarawa on November 27th to prepare for the arrival of Admiral Nimitz, who had flown to the Ellis Islands from Hawaii and was now flying in from Funafuti aboard a troop carrier and cargo plane. As they inspected the Japanese fortifications, Spruance said little. His impassive face hid whatever thoughts came into his mind as he saw firsthand the utter devastation his forces had wrought. When Nimitz arrived, he was outwardly deeply affected. He would later say that he had never in his life seen such desolation as at Tarawa. Lieutenant General Richardson, who accompanied Nimitz from Hawaii, had seen the Ypres battlefield in World War I. Tarawa, he told Nimitz, was comparable. The High Army and Navy brass and main elements of the Southern Attack Force departed the Gilberts on November 30th. The first naval aircraft had arrived and were based on the airfield at Tarawa, and the Army Air Force garrison had landed. By the first week of December, American aircraft, flying from the Gilberts, would be conducting bombing and photo reconnaissance missions over the Marshalls, the next objective in the amphibious war in the Central Pacific. Once back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz announced the official end of combat in the Gilberts and declared the campaign complete. He told the press that Makin had been a pushover, but he revealed that the preliminary estimate the Marines at Tarawa had suffered was 1,026 killed in action out of a total of 3,600 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in the 167 years of U.S. Marine Corps history. Publication of the figures, which would be adjusted downward slightly as the full cost of the battle was learned, created a firestorm of accusation and recrimination in Washington. When Holland Smith got back to Hawaii, he was shocked by the stir the long casualty lists had caused on the mainland. Unjustly pushed to the wall to account for the loss of life and limb, the old warhorse could only counter, "No way yet has been found to make war safe and easy." Assistant Secretary of the Navy Ralph A. Bard issued the Navy view. The Marines who took Tarawa knew that a beachhead would cost them many men, but they did not stop to count the cost in their own lives. Lieutenant General Alexander A. Vandergrift, the victor of Guadalcanal, who had recently been named the U.S. Marine Corps Commandant, delivered the final post-mortem on Tarawa in Washington. "No one regrets the losses more than the Marine Corps itself," he said. "No one realizes more than does the Marine Corps that there is no royal road to Tokyo. We must steel our people to the same realization." Vice Admiral Harold R. Stark, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Naval Forces in Europe, saw in the American action at Tarawa evidence of gallantry of the sort that should be commemorated. This former Chief of Naval Operations observed, "In the selfless valor of the young Marines who fought that action against such terrible odds, and of the sailors who supported them, was sacrifice of which not only Americans, but free men everywhere, can rightly be proud. Tarawa was not a large action, but the human mind can perhaps more readily comprehend it because of its dimensions." Finally, he concluded, the battle was one of the epics of the war in the Pacific. Even as the last fighting went on at Tarawa and the first admirals and generals had gone ashore to examine their handiwork, the final cost of Operation Galvanic in men and material was yet to be paid. One of the overwhelming lessons of World War II was that, even with the advent of the carrier battle group, the submarine was the most deadly naval weapon. This was proved decisively in the darkness of November 24th off Makin. Since entering the Central Pacific a week before, the Americans had been expecting the Japanese Navy to come by air and by sea. Yet while the Fifth Fleet carrier crews were preoccupied with preparations for the next day's air operations, the major concern of the air admirals and carrier captains was Japanese submarines. Numerous sightings of periscopes had been made in the Makin area since November 20th, and ever since SINCPAC had issued its general alert about enemy submarines on D-Day +1, ASW had been an all-consuming worry of the naval commanders. The escort carrier group left behind to cover the army garrison at Makin was steaming at a leisurely 15 knots through a gentle swell some 20 miles southwest of Butaritari. Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix of Indiana, the top graduate of the Naval Academy in 1916, was in command of the group of jeep carriers, including Liskum Bay, Coral Sea, and Corregidor. These were traveling in company with the battleship New Mexico, flagship of the Fire Support Group, and its commander, Rear Admiral Robert M. Griffin, and a screen composed of 4 destroyers and a minesweeper. The sonar of these escorts blasted the deep black water all around without surfeit. Mullenix was flying his flag aboard Liskum Bay, commanded by Captain Irving D. Wiltsey. The little flotilla spent the hours of darkness uneventfully, preparing for the next day's operations. Beneath a moon obscured by thick clouds, the carrier crews readied planes for dawn launch. Aboard Liskum Bay, 13 planes had been spotted on the flight deck, armed, fueled, and ready to launch at sunrise. 7 more were below, armed but not yet fueled. Meanwhile, bogies, unidentified aircraft, were registering on radar. During the night, one of the destroyers was dispatched to Makin, and the rest of the escort screen redeployed, adjusting their positions to cover a larger area. At 0435 Commander, Nicholas A. Lidston, commanding the destroyer Franks, made an urgent report to Griffin. His lookouts had sighted a dim, flashing light. Despite the possibility that an enemy submarine might be lurking about, Griffin detached Franks from the escort screen in order to investigate the light. The departure of a second destroyer further thinned the already slim screen. As Franks darted out of formation, the remaining tin cans moved up to cover the gap. Shortly thereafter, New Mexico's powerful radar established a surface contact to the northeast. It did not seem to belong to an American formation, but the technicians were at a loss to explain it. They watched the contact for 4 minutes, until it faded and disappeared. False radar contacts were common at this time in the war, and since no sound contact had been made, the carrier group executed a predetermined turn in a northerly direction. In preparation for dawn launch, Wiltsey took Liskum Bay to general quarters at 0505. 3 minutes later, Franks reported that it had found a float light dropped by an enemy plane. These were used as signals to any Japanese aircraft that might be in the area that American targets were also around. At 0507, the formation of ships turned again in order to face the carriers into the light southeasterly breeze. This time they turned in a northeasterly direction, right into the submerged periscope sights of Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata aboard the Japanese submarine 1-175. It had been I-175 running on the surface which New Mexico's radar had picked up. The 1,785-ton type KD-6B ocean-going submarine had been on patrol with its crew of 60 men northeast of the Marshalls, when Rear Admiral Takagi at Truk ordered Tabata to rush to the Gilberts and do what he could to impede the invasion. I-175 arrived on November 23rd, but that day 4 patrolling destroyers had prohibited Tabata from engaging any of the numerous fat targets moving about off Makin. Now, however, Tabata attacked. He fired a spread of torpedoes from 1,500 yards, then wheeled around to vacate the area. The fish ran straight and true. Liskum Bay never had a chance. Survivors from the bridge believed that she was hit by 2 torpedoes. Others, including a man who had been stationed below the forward fire room, said that possibly as many as 3 torpedoes had struck amidships. Whatever the number, at 5:16 the doomed carrier suddenly seemed to explode. At least 1 torpedo had hit the main bomb storage compartment, and every warhead therein detonated instantaneously. Perhaps as much as 135,000 pounds of He bombs, 9 2,000-pound bombs, 78 1,000-pound bombs, and 96 500-pound bombs went up all at once. 1 second she was there solid and untroubled, recalled an observer who had been idly watching the baby flat top from another ship about half a mile away. The next she was only a sheet of flame shooting skyward, smoke billowing, and a few moments later my ear caught the report. Lieutenant Commander Oliver Ames, the senior surviving officer, reported the explosion as a huge column of bright orange-coloured flames, with incandescent spots streaking through it, like white-hot metal. Men aboard the ships in the escort screen, through which I-175 had manoeuvred and attacked, saw a column of fire and molten metal flare 1,000 feet high. Some ships reported a single large roaring explosion. Others reported multiple explosions that occurred simultaneously. So great was the unearthly force that burst the carrier apart that New Mexico, 1,500 yards away, and the destroyer Maury, 5,000 yards distant, were showered with burning oil and fragments of steel, clothing and human limbs as the entire after-third of Liskum Bay was destroyed. Commander F.T. Williamson, captain of the destroyer Morris, had witnessed the deaths of the carriers Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet, but reported that even he had never seen anything like the fiery end of Liskum Bay. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander John R. Bodler, and the navigator, Lieutenant Commander Delancey Nicholl, saw that even with the most efficient damage control there was no hope of saving the carrier. They gave the order to abandon ship. Fire swiftly raced throughout the interior and rose through the timbers of the flight deck. As ammunition and fuel supplies caught fire and exploded, the flight deck collapsed and flames reached up to engulf the superstructure. An unusual holder of the Navy Cross was among the hundreds of men pushing their way to the upper deck from darkened, smoke-filled and rapidly flooding compartments below. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, Seaman Doris Dory Miller of Waco, Texas, then a mess attendant aboard the battleship West Virginia, had shot down 2, and perhaps as many as 5 of the 29 Japanese aircraft downed that day. For his action at Pearl Harbor, Miller became the first African American to receive the Navy Cross. He died in the Liskum Bay Inferno. Lieutenant Commander John B. Rowe, the ship's surgeon, was huddled in the sick bay with 3 corpsmen and a patient when the first explosion knocked them down. As they scrambled back to their feet, another detonation threw them to the deck again. Somehow all of them made it topside and into the water. Rowe soon was working from the sick bay aboard Morris. Lieutenant Commander Wells W. Carroll, though badly wounded, led a damage control team to restore pressure to the ruptured fire main, but to no avail. Admiral Mullenix, Captain Wiltsey, and the executive officer, Commander Finley E. Hall, were last seen sliding down a line into the fire-swept sea. Crewmen who survived, especially those who were burned, suffered terribly. They struggled in the oil and wreckage to free life rafts, but only a pitiful few craft were actually launched. At 5:35, Liskum Bay flared up for one last time and sank stern first, settling into a 2,000-fathom trench. She went down in less than 5 minutes. The escort ships decided to pick up survivors rather than make good their own escape from danger or look for the enemy submarine. The rescue work was complicated by the fires burning on the surface of the sea. One man on the stricken carrier, operated on for appendicitis a mere 2 days earlier, climbed into the whaleboat launched from Morris. He asked for a rubber boat so he might return to the sea and try to rescue more of his shipmates. It was all too familiar to Seaman T.R. Furness, an electrician's mate from Morris, who went into the water numerous times to rescue men. He had done the same in October 1942 after the Hornet had been fatally damaged by a torpedo launched by a Japanese submarine. In that action, Furness had won the Silver Star for his gallantry. Lieutenant Lauren H. Killian and Ensign Joseph R. Geraint located a rubber raft aboard Morris and paddled through the burning oil to pick up wounded men clinging to a piece of floating wreckage. It was a stunning blow to the U.S. Navy, the loss of one of its new escort carriers. The sinking of Liskum Bay claimed the lives of 644 of the 959 American seamen who had been aboard her. The disaster accounted for the greatest loss of life from the sinking of a single warship at sea in the history of the U.S. Navy, until, significantly, a Japanese submarine put a torpedo into the cruiser Indianapolis in the last month of the war, and 883 men died. Soldiers of the 165th RCT aboard the transport Leonard Wood, one of the ships closest to the carrier when it blew up, had helped rescue many survivors. Lieutenant Colonel S.L.A. Marshall was among those on the transport. All of the post-battle happiness was gone as we steamed back to Pearl, he remembered. The survivors sat in the wardroom day after day, shocked men who would respond to a question if asked but were otherwise lost in their brooding. They stared into space. Games were not for them. They would not even communicate with one another. It was my first and only experience with group shock. Yet as devastating as the loss of Liskum Bay had been, it was a question of too little too late. The combined fleet lay impotently at anchor at Truk. The reinforcements that had left for Tarawa aboard the cruisers Juzu and Naka ended up on Mili, where the war eventually passed them by. 4 more cruisers, Jumano, Chokai, Noshiro and Suzuya, practically all that remained from the debacle at Rabaul, and a dozen destroyers sorted from the Carolines, but the battle was over before they reached Kwajalein. Admiral Koga recalled them when they had been gone from Truk for just a few days. Of the other Japanese naval forces available for action, only the 6th Fleet submarines were dispatched to the Gilberts. I-35, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, had been sunk off Tarawa. 5 other submarines also failed to return. I-19, the submarine that had sunk the American carrier Wasp in 1942, was also lost to enemy action. The destroyer Radford cornered her on November 25th about 60 miles west of Makin, and depth-charged her to the bottom with 4 attacks spanning several hours. Radford also accounted for the destruction of I-40. 3 other Japanese submarines, I-39, I-21 and RO-38, failed to return to the Marshalls, fate unknown. Of 9 submarines that had been sent to the Gilberts, only 3 returned from their patrols. The other dimension of the Japanese defence, air power, could not be brought fully into play until November 27th. On this night, however, 100 aircraft flew off the airfields in the Marshalls in search of the American carriers. 30 torpedo bombers found the carrier battle group comprising Enterprise, Belleau Wood and Monterey north of the Gilberts, and attacked just after nightfall. The nightcap of Enterprise succeeded in breaking up the attack, but at a cost. Lieutenant Commander Edward H. Butch O'Hare, one of the first heroes of the war, was shot down and killed. O'Hare had won the Medal of Honor in February 1942 after single-handedly shooting down 6 enemy bombers that were attacking Lexington off Rabaul. His loss was a demoralizing blow to the Navy. Another Japanese air attack was beaten off the next day by the destroyer screen. On December 4th, Rear Admiral Pownall took his fast carrier forces deep into the Marshalls for one last strike at the Japanese before retiring back to Hawaii. An enormous flight of Hellcats, Dauntlesses and Avengers swept over Kwajalein on this day and inflicted serious damage to the enemy base. 18 Japanese fighters were shot down in wild melees, and a dozen bombers were destroyed on the ground. Several ships, including a cruiser, were left burning in the large Blue Lagoon. Not willing to expose the carriers to further risk, Pownall elected to disengage before the Japanese could regroup and come at the exhausted American carrier crews again. Although the carrier captains objected strongly to fleeing the area, they wanted to hit the Japanese airfields again. Pownall was in command and his orders stood. He granted the airmen one final mission against Watya, where a dozen bombers were found and burned out. Task Force 50 then collected its far-ranging aircraft and headed for Hawaii. That night, however, before they were beyond enemy airspace, a Japanese air attack achieved a measure of success when a bomber put a torpedo into the stern of Lexington. The enemy warhead killed 9 men and wounded 35 and left the rudder jammed. With the rest of the marauding American carriers, Lady Lex limped back to Pearl Harbor. A final sequel to the battle for the Gilberts was as bitter, if less momentous. On December 8th, the carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey, 5 battleships and a dozen destroyers struck Nauru on their way back to join Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet in the South Pacific. The warships bombarded the island from a range of only 1,500 yards, while the planes of the carriers wrecked the airfield. Perhaps 10 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground. When the destroyer Boyd came within 2 miles of the island in order to investigate a life raft, the Japanese retaliated. A large-caliber shore battery opened up and in quick succession put 2 shells into the ship, one into the engine room and another into the forward stack. Boyd soon controlled her fires, but 10 men had been killed and 20 or more wounded. The stricken ship retired as swiftly as possible, zigzagging, and managed to reach Ep.8 under her own steam. Only then were the books closed on Operation Galvanic, nearly a month after the B-24s of the 7th Air Force had commenced the furious campaign to seize from the Japanese their gains in the Gilbert Islands. That was it. The time for naivete had passed. There had been plenty of glory and plenty of gore. After the dramatic 26 days of Operation Galvanic, there was a general belief among American soldiers, sailors, coast guardsmen, marines and airmen, if not also their political, naval and military leaders, that too little of the glory and too much of the gore lay ahead in the war in the Pacific. The battle for the Gilberts, as was clearly apparent at the time, was a stunning American victory. In the 4 days of fighting on Tarawa and Makin atolls, the Japanese lost their bid once and for all for a limited victory, if in fact they had not already done so at Midway and Guadalcanal. For the United States, the bloodletting was convincing evidence that winning the war against Japan would not be easy. The hit-and-run raids against Rabaul and other targets by the American fast carrier forces, in which the core of Japanese naval air power was irrevocably lost, opened a strategic gap between the opposing sides, which the Imperial Combined Fleet could never hope to overcome. The issue of battle in the Gilberts had depended on air power. Victory and defeat had turned on whether the Japanese could succeed in crushing either or both the American amphibious forces and fast carriers, before Rear Admiral Spruance could exploit the gap created at Rabaul and gain a forward foothold in the Central Pacific. The American fast carrier forces established air supremacy over the Gilberts and held it from start to finish. What remained of Japanese air power entered the battle too slowly and utterly failed to influence the outcome. Yet so close had the Japanese come to victory on the incomparably small island of Betio, despite having written off the Gilberts many months before, so near had the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps come to disaster, that the battle by which Operation Galvanic came to be best known is today still commonly referred to as Terrible Tarawa, or the Tarawa Killing Ground. For decades thereafter, mere mention of Tarawa at a reunion of Marines was enough to engender deep remorse. Among naval and military historians, even today the debate continues over whether the costs were worth it. Major General Holland Smith, who knew something of the mystique of marine esprit de corps, understood Tarawa in a way few others were willing then or now to admit. His verdict, which he revealed to a group of correspondents while touring the Japanese fortifications after the battle: "Gentlemen, it was their will to die." The Japanese, suddenly encountering Americans who, with total disregard for the risks, threw themselves into the fury of heavy automatic weapons and artillery firing at point-blank range, understood it too. More than anything else, said the few Japanese prisoners captured, it had been the sight of wave upon wave of green-clad infantry climbing over the seawall and over their own dead to secure the beachhead that had broken the enemy's resolve to resist. Said a Japanese officer after the war, "Such driven American courage and bravery was something we had not expected to see when the war began." But marine valor at Tarawa notwithstanding, it was the resurgence of American sea power after Pearl Harbor that determined the issue in the Gilberts. And beyond sea power, the errors and shortcomings of Japanese planning contributed as much as the heroism of the American fighting forces to final victory. If the Japanese had not sent the cream of their remaining naval air strength to Rabaul and had kept it based at Truk instead, these assets would have been available from the start of Galvanic and might have seriously impeded the American amphibious assault. The meagre land-based air forces already in the Marshalls might then have provided the extra strength to pierce the overstretched and immobile American air umbrella and overwhelm one or more of the beachheads or their supporting naval forces. Yet Rear Admiral Spruance's unnatural disposition of his available air strength at least shielded the bat zone from mass air attacks. The importance of this element was underscored indirectly by Major Rathvon M. Tompkins, the 2nd Marine Division Assistant Operations Officer. Tarawa, he said 10 years after the fact, was the only landing in the Pacific that the Japanese could have defeated. In its grand gamble in the Gilberts, the United States accomplished overwhelming numerical and material superiority over a broader front and to a degree it had not been able to achieve at any one time in the South Pacific, except at the end of the long, drawn-out struggle for Guadalcanal. The enfeeblement of Japanese naval and air forces was partly responsible, but the balance was tipped by the warships and fast carriers borrowed from the embattled Third Fleet of Vice Admiral Halsey in the South Pacific. All during Galvanic, while the carriers of Rear Admirals Pownall and Radford isolated the Marshalls, Rear Admiral Montgomery held shut the back door to the Gilberts with carriers borrowed from Halsey. For more than a month, some carriers fought an almost continuous series of air actions until, fearing Japanese retaliation on a scale not possible, Pownall pulled them back too soon. If the Fifth Fleet carriers had given way at any point before that, assuming that the Japanese had been able to launch a swift and determined counterattack, the end in the Gilberts might have been different. At the least, American losses would have been much greater. If there was an indispensable feature to Galvanic, ironically it was the strategic weapon used least efficiently, the fast carrier forces. Misused and poorly led though they were at this time in the war, the fast carrier forces still provided the ultimate margin of victory. Similarly, without Colonel Shoup, no marine beachhead would have been established at Tarawa. It was his determination and coolness under fire during the tragic and terrible first 2 days of stalemate that prevented the Marines from fully disintegrating. With the exception of Colonel Edson, it is difficult to imagine a more quick-thinking, confident commander who could have led the Marines out of chaos against such awful odds. "The brainiest, finest soldiering Marine I ever knew," said one of the men who remained closest to Shoup during the battle. "Without him, the bastards would have pushed us off that damn rock," said another. Besides the grievous casualties to their ranks, the Marines rued the battle because of the LVTs. 75 of them that were, judged combat capable, were already in the table of organisation and equipment of the 2nd Division in New Zealand. With 100 more, each carrying 20 riflemen and making the 800 to 1200-yard round trip to shore once, Major. General Julian Smith figured that he could transport about 3,000 assault troops, 3 reinforced rifle battalions, across the deadly barrier reef and into the beachhead. Only 50 more LVTs were provided, however, enough to land only 2,000 Marines rather than 3,000. In the end, the LVT battalion was the hardest hit of any unit committed to battle at Tarawa. Julian Smith later estimated that 35 of the tracked vehicles filled with water and sank on their own or were destroyed in deep water by gunfire. 26 sank or were knocked out on the reef. 9 burned when their fuel tanks ignited as a result of hits. 2 were blown up by underwater mines. 10 were wrecked on the beaches and seawall, and 8 were lost to mechanical failures. Of the 651 sailors and Marines attached to the battalion, 323 were killed or wounded, including both the commander and deputy commander. Perhaps no other special services unit in any branch of the American armed forces lost a greater proportion of its personnel killed and wounded in a single battle of the war than the 2nd LVT Battalion at Tarawa. After the Gilberts there followed the American thrust into the Marshalls, the envelopments of Truk and Rabaul, the fall of Saipan, Tinian and Guam, and the battle for Iwo Jima. After this, with the end of combat on small islands, came the slow, deadly siege of Okinawa. In each brutal encounter over the next 18 months after Tarawa, the tactics of amphibious assault that were proved in the Gilberts carried the day. The recommendations made and acted upon as a result of the Gilberts offensive, said Holland Smith after the marshals, proved sound. For the Japanese, the Yogaki plan, or waylaying attack, had failed to slow the Americans in the Gilberts, as it later would in the marshals at Truk and in the Marianas. But the failure of Yogaki was the byproduct of the risky RO operation. This more than anything else was responsible for the loss of the Gilberts, and later the entire Central Pacific, more so even than the Japanese decision not to fight for the islands to the finish. It ultimately allowed the Americans to arrive and concentrate relatively unopposed in the Central Pacific, permitting them to finish the job of assault, siege, and seizure on islands long before the Japanese were able to gather even token forces from their scattered and grossly weakened naval and air strength. When Admiral Fukudome called the almost complete loss of carrier planes at Rabaul a mortal blow to Japan, he had not been exaggerating. In fact, before the end of the war, such developments led to a strategic situation that could be countered, on successively greater scales, only by a degree of attrition that was to make Tarawa the progenitor of the battle for Okinawa in 1945. The RO operation was an error of commission by the Imperial General Headquarters that could never be repaired. In many ways, the failure of the RO operation was as fatal as the failure at Midway, and together they affirmed the inevitable defeat of Japan before the war was fully 2 years old. The air losses at Rabaul in the autumn of 1943 ate up Japanese air strength at a rate that predetermined the failure of other later similar efforts, such as that of Operation Ago, which the world came to call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which might otherwise have hurt the Allied war effort badly. Thus, no matter where one looks for cause and effect, it was the attrition in the air that determined the future course of the Great Pacific conflict, and, as a result, the means of Allied victory. After the battle for the Gilberts, the war increased exponentially in scale and intensity, until at Okinawa it would inflict a ghastly 150,000 casualties in 3 months. Operation Galvanic was one of the turning points of the war in the Pacific, not because it demonstrated that Japan would go down in defeat or that the Allies would win the war. This had been determined on December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked and the American carriers escaped destruction. Rather, Tarawa and the battle for the Gilberts demonstrated graphically that in some ways the Pacific War would be nearly as costly to the United States as the conflict in Europe, and that the Japanese would fight for what they had taken, if necessary, to the last man on both sides. As it was, Galvanic became the key from which the most important part of the subsequent campaign in the Pacific theatre of operations developed. After Tarawa, in particular, it was truly as Admiral Nimitz had said to Admiral King, "It'll only become worse." In Operation Galvanic, the battle for the Gilberts, American land, sea and air forces suffered casualties comparable to losses in the much longer and more publicized Guadalcanal campaign. In the 6 months of battle that raged on, over and around Guadalcanal from August 1942 until February 1943, American losses among soldiers, sailors, marines and airmen reached an estimated 6,960 killed or missing. Of these, 1,207 Marines and 562 soldiers were killed, and another 2,600 troops wounded out of 60,000 men committed to action on the notorious Island of Death itself. The Americans lost about 3 times as many dead at sea as they did on land. In comparison, Japanese losses may have been as high as 26,000 on the ground and 5,000 in the air and at sea. In the 26 days of Galvanic, from November 13th through December 8th, 1943, combined casualties of Spruance's Central Pacific Force, in killed, wounded, captured and missing on land, at sea and in the air, amounted to about 5,100. Of these, at least 2,000 were killed. Total losses among marine and supporting personnel at Tarawa were a harrowing 3,500, divided between 1,147 dead and 2,353 wounded. The conquest of Tarawa alone cost 3 times as many American lives as had the landings in North Africa, twice as many as in seizing the beachhead on Sicily, and only about 500 less than the awesome 2-week struggle for a foothold on the European continent at Salerno, Italy. with losses totaling 20% of their forces committed to the battle for the Gilberts. U.S. Marine Corps casualties were by far the greatest. They reached 3,429. Julian Smith's magnificent 2nd Marine Division was all but shattered, and after rebuilding and retraining itself, would not see action again until 7 months later at Saipan. Among the 15,700 troops who fought only on tiny Betio, not including 1,400 sailors and coast guardsmen who also landed, losses totaled 3,333. Of these, 1,085 were killed, later died of wounds, or were missing and presumed dead. The wounded numbered 2,248. The 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, which did not fight on Betio but secured the rest of Tarawa Atoll, lost 32 killed and 61 wounded in the march up the atoll and in the final action at Bwariki and Lone Tree Islet. In addition, 3 Marines were killed or wounded at Abemama, making a total of 1,118 Marines killed and 2,311 wounded in the battle for the Gilberts. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard sustained approximately 1,400 casualties of all types, of which more than 850 were killed. These figures include combat casualties among corpsmen, coxswains, shore parties, Seabees and air crews, as well as losses related to the battle. These latter include the seamen lost in the tragic sinking of the escort carrier Liskum Bay, the mishap aboard the battleship Mississippi, the torpedoing of both the fleet carrier Lexington off Kwajalein and the light carrier Independence off Tarawa, the sinking of the submarines Corvina and Sculpin, the shelling of the destroyer Boyd off Nauru, and the seamen who fell during the Japanese shelling of the transports at Tarawa on D-Day. United States Army casualties are put at about 305. This figure is based primarily on the official military history of the battle for Makin, which gives the following breakdown: 58 killed in action, 8 who died of wounds, 152 wounded in action, and 35 injured in non-combat incidents. Included in the overall compilation are the 7th Air Force losses, which amounted to about 50 killed and wounded among air crews and air service support ground personnel. What were Japanese losses? Over the decades, a variety of vague and misleading figures have been given on the casualties suffered by Japanese forces during the battle for the Gilberts. None of them, of course, can be said to be accurate. At best, they must remain estimates, for by the very nature of the war in the Pacific and the tremendous destruction wrought upon Japanese garrisons, it was always impossible for anyone, friend or foe, to arrive at an exact figure after any battle. However, a compilation of the most reliable official sources reveals that the Japanese and Korean casualties in the Marshalls and Gilberts during Galvanic may have reached 7,000, possibly only a third more than overall American losses. Although no exact breakdown is available for the total number of enemy killed, wounded, and captured, including the battles for Tarawa and Makin, the losses on other islands in the Gilberts, and losses in the air and at sea, we conservatively estimate that the Japanese lost at least 6,000 men, practically all of whom were killed. Without question, the casualties at Tarawa Atoll were by far the worst. They reached almost 4,900, of whom all but 17 Japanese and 129 Koreans were killed. Of the 650 to 800 men who defended Makin, only 280 of whom were combat troops, at least 550 died. Losses suffered as a result of naval and air action in the Gilberts and Marshalls reached 500 to 1,000. Whatever the true count, which we will never know, by the end of the year, commanders were to report to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo that personnel losses in the Central Pacific since the attack on the Gilberts were 2 admirals, a half-dozen senior officers, 2,000 labourers, and 8,500 naval infantry, airmen and sailors. Numerous naval losses, such as the 6 submarines that failed to return after the Gilberts debacle and the shipping losses inflicted in Pownall's raids on the Marshalls, must have contributed to these figures. Casualties among the non-combatant native population in the Gilberts were never reported. They were suggested to have been low, but no one could know with any certainty. Taking into account the forced relocation of residents from most garrison islands in the Gilberts and Marshalls and figures from after-action reports and historical surveys, it can be estimated that fewer than 25 were killed and wounded. Most of these occurred at Makin, and were the result of naval shelling and the use of civilians as human shields by the defenders.